I'm curious. I am curious. Curious
by nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. The run-up to the 2024 U.S. presidential election has seen unprecedented levels of misinformation, division, and hate speech on social media. Even as Election Day comes and goes and the votes are being counted, the temperature of online discourse is only likely to rise. Online conversations about race, immigration, and other hot-button topics continue to attract extremist views that threaten to drown out anything resembling civil discourse. How do communities of hate operate, and how do they create their networks of users to infiltrate both the major platforms as well as darker corners of the web? To understand complex systems such as this, one researcher at George Washington University is using his background in particle physics to map and analyze how hate speech flows on social media. We spoke before Election Day and before any of the votes were counted. So without knowing the outcome, he gives a sobering warning that the biggest spike in online hate is likely to come after voters go to the polls. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining us. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your work.
My name is Neil Johnson. I'm professor of physics at George Washington University.
And can you tell me more broadly about your work and what you do?
Yeah, so many people have an idea of what physics has to do with. It should be kind of either the really small stuff, kind of splitting atoms, or it should be the really big stuff like the Big Bang. But really, physics, to me, it's not so much the problem you work on, it's how you work on that problem. Now, with that in mind, there are so many problems in the world that are worth working on, but they're not the kind of usual diet of physicists. I tend to go for those types of problems, those kind of what problems that are kind of seen within physics as taboo, kind of outside of physics. I tend to go for those kind of problems like online behavior, misbehavior, etc., precisely because they're not meant to be physics. And yet, if you look at them with a kind of physics mind, maybe there's something new that you can add. So that's why I work on these kind of complex problems where it's not just one thing going on that needs to be fixed with a screwdriver or something, where you're not even sure where the problem's actually coming from. I think those are fascinating.
Yes, and I mean, this will bring us into more of the specific issue that lately you published a paper on, which the title of your recent paper is How U.S. Presidential Elections Strengthen Global Hate Networks. And can you tell me more about that and how that relates to physics?
At first sight, you might think, well, of course there's more hatred around elections. There will be anywhere in the world. That's absolutely true. But it's not about the amount of hate. What we found in our paper in particular is that it's almost like it's where that hate is that makes it so surprising to us and concerning, kind of what in terms of what it means for society. So we set out with the physics mindset of not just kind of focusing in on particular stories. So the media, journalists have been fantastic in following particular stories, examples where a particular influencer or a particular online person or a particular person is spreading, kind of what you could deem as hate speech. But that's a little bit, it seems to us, a little bit like asking the question about, going to a doctor or something and saying, well, I've got a pain in my back, but I only want you to look at that tiny little piece of my back where I've got that problem. A doctor has to think of the whole system because anything showing a symptom may have a cause in other parts. In our physics way of thinking, that's equivalent to saying, if I've got a problem in some system, I better understand the system. So we came at this problem with the idea that we should map out not just what is on the platforms we've all heard about, Facebook, old Twitter, now X, but what about the other platforms? What about these platforms that don't appear in front of Congress with the CEO on a seat in front of them? What about those? There's, 20, 30 with names like BitChute, Gab. There's plenty of people on them, but they're small. and some of them are not US owned, and they're hard to control. What we found in our paper is that the sum of lots of pieces, the sum of all of those small platforms, is where the glue that binds together online hate actually sits. And what we found was around the last election, and we're seeing it now, it's not so much that there's more hate, there's certainly more hate, but it's where it is. It's in these, it's acting as a glue from communities on some of these smaller platforms, reaching out to communities that may be more on the fence in mainstream platforms and kind of pulling them all together. And that is the root of the problem. And that also then explains why, how many of us have maybe tuned in or seen the highlights of a congressional hearing about online media and the problems of online harms, which seems to go down the line of, Facebook do more. Facebook says we are doing more. Well, you've got to do more. Well, we are doing more. Well, how can they both be right? Well, this mapping that we do across all of these platforms says, well, actually, you're both right and you're both wrong in some sense. Just removing content from a major platform does nothing to stop it coming back in. It's a little bit like an infestation in a yard. If you try and get rid of the but if it's coming in from the neighbors, then, every time you wipe it out, it will come back again. And the problem is online, everybody's a neighbor. And so this problem won't be beaten until we have, for example, at the back of every congressional hearing, some great big mapping that shows where the major platforms are, where the smaller platforms, these lots of smaller platforms, and where the communities are that are spreading harmful material, hate, and how they connect to each other, what that web is.
This is so interesting because I think many people hear about the increase in hate, but they don't necessarily participate in it themselves or on some of these platforms. And so they don't really know where it is or where it's lying or how much of it exists sometimes.
Yeah. And because it sounds far away from our everyday lives, we think of it as a fringe. Found in our study, and we're mapping it out, is, well, this is a fringe that's actually next door. It's next door in the sense that communities, harmful communities promoting harm from any one of these smaller platforms, create hyperlinks. They create a link, just a clickable link within their community to some mainstream parenting group on Facebook or some mainstream community group of some other kind on Facebook. And it directs their members and therefore enables their members to make comments on that mainstream community. And so often when we see comments that look maybe slightly inappropriate or that are kind of pushing the edge, could be true that these are coming from these communities that are meant to be fringe that unfortunately are actually next door.
Mm-hmm. Or have infiltrated or infested too.
Or have, yes, and those are great analogies. And so our job as from the science point of view is to test how much that analogy is true. So, for example, is it like an infestation? Is it therefore treatable by something analogous to what you would do? And the strategy, is it treatable by something analogous to how you would treat an infestation? And can we learn from other situations? So our job is to kind of put the substance on those mental images, those mental models, those analogies, so that we can better deal with the problem.
And why is physics such a good way of looking at this? Can you tell me more about the details of how it's done?
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to offend any physicist online, but I think physicists are, in reality, we have a bunch of trades, none of which we're masters of. We know a bit of math, we know a bit of computing, we know a little bit of drawing networks, we know a little bit of how to estimate things. None as good as kind of professional mathematicians or the professional computer scientists. But putting those skills together gives a way of looking at the problem that has all the elements that you need. You need to quantify the problem. So again, I go back to the congressional hearings because I think that's the good example of where we don't really hear numbers. Oh, there's a big problem online with online harm. I never hear a number associated with that. I'd like to hear, well, because there are, and we know these numbers, there are 1,000 communities on any one platform, very crudely speaking, that are promoting, that have content that in the last 20 posts the Department of Justice will classify as hate speech. That's a very concrete thing to know. I never hear that phrase. That's the kind of thing we map out by knowing a little bit of math, a little bit of computer science, and putting these elements together, as physicists would look, for example, at the universe and try and get a picture of the universe without ever going there. I mean, without being able to visit all the universe, you build up a picture based on, well, I put this together with this and put these pieces together. That's what we're trying to do online. And I think that gives something valuable in addition to the usual discussions.
You just said about the DOJ and their definition of hate speech. First of all, could you tell me what that is? And are you measuring the global hate networks by whether they have that speech within them or used by those members?
We have taken as a working definition, and we've tried different versions of this to make sure our results are robust, and they are. But we take as a working definition, have in the last 20 posts and comments and replies and all of those kind of things, which usually counts for quite a few months, for some of the communities at least, is there speech that, and we use a computer-based system to do this, that corresponds to, that uses words that are classified as hate speech against, and the Department of Justice has a particular definition of hate speech, which goes, it's targeting certain kind of communities, et cetera, et cetera. So some of it can be based race, some of it is religion, some of it is against, it's misogynistic, et cetera, et cetera. So we use that to keep it strict. Of course, we could generalize that. Some extremism isn't hate speech, but could be included in that. And then we take those communities that have that within them in the 20 recent posts, and we look who they link to, what posts they link to, and does that generate some kind of activity within the community? And when it does, we count that as a link between the two communities, because in effect, the two communities have been linked because the members of the originator of the link now know about that other community, whereas they wouldn't know about it at all. And they can visit it, and they can also invite people from that community back into their own community. So it builds a bond. And all of this, even though we're talking about something as unpleasant as hate, they also have a trust that develops between them, because in some sense they're under attack from the outside, quite rightly. But they build a defense mechanism. Their defense mechanism is to build connections between communities, and they often pass from one to the other when their moderators get near them.
I imagine that you really looked at the connections of these groups, but not necessarily maybe like why or comparing to positive speech or things like that. But maybe what were some of the things that interesting conclusions that came out of looking at this data?
Right. So one of the things that we found is that Telegram, the platform Telegram, was really good at acting as a glue between the platforms that we all know about. Now, for anyone that, just to remind people, Telegram is it's a commercial platform. It doesn't particularly have an agenda, but it's because it's trying to make money, but it's quite loose in its moderation. And so it becomes natural habitat for communities that want to be safe themselves and yet create hate-based material. And so in that line, there are quite a number of white supremacy, non-US white supremacy communities that are based around Nordic, Aryan type of viewpoints of kind of, and therefore promoting ideas of replacement theories, conspiracy theories. They are quite integrated into US online life, much more than we expected. You might think, I mean, what are the Norway or Sweden, some white supremacist group up there, what have they got to do with US elections? Well, they do have something to do with it, because there are like-minded people who also think that there's some kind of replacement scheme underway. So, they find their common ground online. And those UK riots, I go back to those, some of the key communities that, because suddenly riots appeared in every city by something that was seemingly unrelated, and yet instantly riots appeared on the streets in cities across the country. We would not like to see that over here. What is it that made that happen? what it was there were particular communities, these hate communities, that were fed into local groups in each of those cities. And to the extent that they are over here, which we don't see that. We do see it into some particular cities, but not widespread, which is good news. That is the kind of insight that can get ahead of not the spark that creates the initial riots, but it stops then that can get ahead of a wave of unrest or a wave of violence happening. The general point is that unless you map this out, you don't know how to even go about treating it.
Did you look at all about what are solutions to this, or do you have ideas?
Yeah. So first thing is this glue has got to be dealt with. You can't let the gunge build up because it clogs up all of the different... It's better to keep the hate communities isolated so that they don't kind of feed off of each other, because once they start feeding off of each other, they get, they feel that they're not in some small community on some small island. They are the majority. Mm-hmm. So that's got to be dealt with. But the second is, how is it possible to take one thing we notice? I mentioned it with the immigration, the anti-Semitic. These are kind of different, and I don't want to I'm not glorifying this in any sense, but they're different flavors of hate. So often we find that when people are in, the kind of narratives in their hate communities, although they appear to support each other, they actually differ from each other on other topics. And so if we could get some kind of connection of them on these other topics where they differ, there's a chance that it will break apart the kind of apparent agreement about, yes, these particular people are worthy of our hate. That's something...
That's the medicine.
Right. And we are looking into that. We actually have a group of psychologists that we're doing small-scale experiments on to see how people with just extreme, not necessarily hate, but with people who have a polarized views on some issue, under what conditions, if you just put them in a room and get them to shout at each other, they'll get more polarized. But under what conditions, if I add in somebody who's in the middle, does that actually weaken both of the sides? And they and the answer is yes, based on pilot studies. So we're looking into this because that added with, instead of having someone in the middle who's a human, someone in the middle who's a piece of AI maybe, that is continually roaming around looking and kind of asking, just getting involved with communities and just asking them stuff and bringing them together and doing this kind of... It is possible, and I haven't got this working yet. It's almost like check back in 2028. But that is possible.
What do you predict will happen with the hate groups based on the 2020 once the elections have happened?
In 2020, the biggest effect we saw was not before the elections. It was as soon as the elections had finished, as soon as voting had finished, almost like the minute voting finished. That's when the rumors start to fly. And that is where these groups kicked in. And so, unfortunately, based on what we saw in 2020, the answer to your question would be in the 3 or 4 days after, until the result is officially announced, then it will probably go kind of a steady quiet. And then the January the 6th, when it's ratified, that will be a focal point.
So maybe we should all try to unplug a little bit around that time, or disconnect, at least avoid possibly getting pulled into any hate groups. Or
if we think hate groups are bad here, you ought to look at them in Central Europe. The Central European and European hate groups are terrible, some of them. It's a very interesting thing that when we were looking at some of the real neo-Nazi type of hate groups, glorification of Hitler, etc., you'd expect to see some angry person with hateful... No, it was pictures of Hitler in sweaters, smiling, stroking cats. And I've never seen that before. I don't think that picture was made up. It was probably made up. But it's that soft approach, because a lot of these...
It's kind of terrifying.
It makes it even more terrifying. A lot of these people actually believe it, and they believe they're doing the right thing. They don't believe they're in the wrong. And so they're not promoting some initially aggressively violent message. They're trying to say, look, we want to take care of you. It's the rest that have got it wrong. We want to take care of you. And the people we need to take care of you from are those people, them. And so they draw you in. This is what we saw in the Central European, a lot of the European hate groups. They draw you in with very safe, soft messages. We want to take care of your kids. We care about children, the next generation. Come with us. And they're the problem, them. And it's then that's when it kicks off. So, yes, I think all of us need to be aware that, when hate comes at you, it doesn't come at you with some angry face and, like in a horror film, it comes at you with some soft approach.
Could you finish this sentence? I'm curious
what will happen when we mix humans, the online world, with the metaverse of wearable sensors and AI.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.